So the last thing that I want to address in troubleshooting this project and just kind of troubleshooting projects in general doesn't have to do necessarily with the efficiency or optimization of physics, but has to do just kind of with organization, moving objects around, and sometimes objects might feel like they're starting to compete with you, particularly in a complex scene like this. So there was an issue the student was having with one of these catapults kind of reacting strange when it was being moved or repositioned or rotated, and it was kind of snapping around. And I've kind of just repositioned this back into the basic position that it was in to begin with, I think. And you can see that it launches this cube over towards another plank here. Now, if I select this first catapult or teeter-totter or cantilever platform here, you'll notice that it's using a hinge joint. And if I select the other ones, they are not using hinge joints. And so this object, because of the hinge joint, references a connected anchor. And that's relative to, if I just duplicate an object, in fact, let me do this with a new object. I'll create just a standard cube, and I'm going to change its dimensions. I'll give some dimension to X. I'll flatten out along the Y, make it a little bit wider along Z, and we have a very similar platform here. You'll notice a couple of things when we add a hinge to this object. It inherits a rigid body. That's the first thing that happens. So whenever we go to component physics, because this is a physics component, it does require a rigid body, and so Unity will apply one for us. So if I choose hinge joint, we get two components. We get the rigid body, and we also get the hinge joint. Now the hinge joint is referencing this connected anchor, which has a position in space, which if you look, the position in space of the connected anchor happens to be the center of the position of this object. And so if I move this object around, you can see that I've kind of just sliding this thing around, and I'm getting now different results from the position to the connected anchor, and that could give us some really weird results. In fact, we can see the hinge or the anchor over here. If I had to zoom in a little bit here, there's a little kind of hairline here, and so if I were to rotate this object, I'm rotating it, and the hinge is moving, and some strange things are happening. Okay, so I'm just going to undo that and kind of get this object back to where its original position. Right now it's going to teeter along the x-axis. That's because of the axis that we're using here in the positive direction was x1, and so I'm going to change this to z1, so it runs in line with the blue axis. Okay, so it'll kind of teeter long ways. Now, what we can do is we'll take a quick look at empty game objects. Empty game objects are extremely valuable. We'll utilize them for a whole host of things. And we can think of an empty game object like a null object in Cinema 4D or an object group in Cinema 4D. And we'll use empty game objects for a whole number of things. So I'm going to demonstrate by going to game object, create empty. Now, I end up with an empty game object. It's selected in the hierarchy. I'll move the empty game object up, and you can see in the inspector and in the hierarchy, I have a game object selected. It's called game object. The only component that it has is a transform. So it just has a position in space. So I have a game object that has no other components. So there's no geometry associated with it or anything else. Now, if I go to game objects and I create a cube, I have a cube, and if I look at the inspector, I have a game object named cube10. It has a transform component. It also has a cube mesh filter, a box collider, a mesh render, and a default material component. Now, if I were to remove all of these components, in fact, I'll do that. I'll go to each one of these and say remove component, remove component, and remove component. I have an object called cube10 that only has a transform component, and this is essentially equivalent to an empty game object. Even though it's called cube, I'll call this empty. Okay, and all it is, we can think of it as kind of a container. It's a game object that can hold other things. It can contains some logic and some scripting. We can use it to manage and track other game objects. This is extremely valuable, okay? So I'm gonna select my empty, I'm gonna delete it, and I'm gonna go back to my game object, empty game object that I created. This empty game object, I'm gonna create two more game objects, a cube and a sphere. I'll take this sphere and move it up. I'll take this cube and move it up. I'll select my empty game object, and you can see that these objects all have a different position in space. Okay, I can select a game object in the hierarchy, and I can do this really with any game object, but I'm going to select my cube, and I'm going to drag and drop it into or on top of my empty game object. And when I do, you can see that the object highlights, and when I drop it, I get a little triangle, and now cube 10 is now nested. This is a parent-child relationship. Cube 10 is now inside game object, and so I'm going to rename game object parent. This is unnecessary, but just want to do this for the demo. I'm going to call this parent. So this is the parent object. It's an empty game object that just has a position in space. I'm going to select sphere 2, and I'm going to drag and drop that onto parent as well. Now when I do, you can see that we have parent. There's a little triangle here, and I can reveal and hide the children. That shows hierarchy. And if I select the parent now, this is an object group. Okay, and you'll notice that if I select the cube has a position of 0. In fact, let me just zero out this position so it'll be a little bit easier to track. If I go to the parent has a position in world space. Okay, and it's currently at x -1 and some change, y 4.31, and z -30 and some change. But if I select the parent and I move this up and down, you can see that the children move with it. If I go to the cube, you'll see that no matter where I move the parent, the children are going to have a relative position to the parent. So right now my cube is still at 0, 0, 0, and that's referencing the parent object. So we're in the parent's space. So as you can see, I can move this parent group around. When I go to cube 10, it's still positioned at 0, 0, 0. This is the difference between local space and world space. Okay, so the children of game objects always refer to their parents. So we can go to the sphere as well, and we can move these independently inside the empty game object. And I'll go back to the parent, and we can move this around. So it'll act like a group. So we can use empty game objects kind of like folders or object groups, which will help keep our scenes organized. So I'm going to delete the parent. You'll notice that when I delete the parent, the children go with it. Now, I'm going to utilize an empty game object to be able to move around this hinged joint rig. This, we have this basic setup of a rigid body. In fact, we have a couple of cubes here, and we have this pedestal. So I'm going to go to game object, create empty, and when I created the empty game object, I do want to point out that it creates the game object in the center of the camera view. Okay, let me delete this empty game object and just demonstrate this again. If I move up and I create a 3D object cube, we always get the object that we created in the center of our scene. Okay, so it's dependent on our view. Okay, and if we create an empty game object, and oops, I wanted to create an empty game object, and it has a strange position in space, and then we throw a couple children in that game object, and so I'm just gonna shift click and select these two objects and see if I can, just to identify them. Oops, didn't want to do that. So cube 2, and I'll drag that into game object 1. I think cube 5 was the other one. I'll drag that into the game object. Now when I select the parent, the empty game object has a center point from the position where I created it. Okay, so there's kind of a strange relationship between the empty game object, but the empty game object is just in its original position where we created it. Now I want to release the parent-child relationship from cube 2 and 5, and so all I have to do is drag this object out. You'll notice that as I drag this out in the hierarchy, I'll either get a rule, okay, which means that I'm placing this object back into the hierarchy between these two game objects, or I'm getting an object to highlight. If I highlight it, that means I'm creating a parent-child relationship and I'm dropping one object into another. I don't want to do that here, so I'm looking for that rule. Okay, so I pulled those two objects out. Now I can get rid of that empty game object. What I want to do is I want to create the empty game object more or less at the center of this pedestal cube. And so a real simple workflow trick for this is to determine the object that you want another object to be centered on and just double click on it. That will zoom your view or frame your view. Alternatively, we can select a game object, make sure our mouse has focus inside our scene view, and tap the F key. F is in Fred, Frank, furry, funny. Once we frame our view, now when I go to game object, create empty, it created the empty game object in the same position as our view, which happens to be the same position as this pedestal, and will give us a more appropriate kind of position for our empty game object. I'm going to call this catapult, and I'll call it catapult rig because it's going to be a combination of a lot of different things. And if I'm just going to select to find what this object is, and we have lots of different cubes in here, and so this is a good case to start to stress that when we create game objects, it's a good idea to start naming them, even if you're not sure what to name it. I'll call this base for now, just as a placeholder. I'll select looks like cube 3, and I'll call this cat platform, so catapult platform, and I'll drag and drop that in my catapult rig. And now the only other two things that I think are going to play a role in this is cube 2 and cube 5. So I'm going to throw those in there as well. Now I don't have to do this, they don't necessarily have to be grouped with it, but now when I grab the catapult rig, I can move this whole setup around. Okay, and as I move this around, okay, we should be able to change the results of the position of the catapult without causing too much trouble. Now I do see there's still a little axis in here, but I'm just going to experiment and see what we end up with. So we can rotate. I'll hit the play button and test it, and it looks like we are in business. Okay, so I'll rotate this around back to 0. Change this position just a little bit, like so. Hit the play button. Okay, so empty game objects can be your friend. Think of them as object folders. Think of them as things that can contain groups of other things. They can be a little tricky if you're not used to working with empty game objects or null objects, but the more experience you get playing with them, the more comfortable you'll be with them. So just one quick reminder of the workflow. Let's say I want to group all the dominoes in this scene together. I'll just double click on one of the dominoes just to kind of get a more appropriate view. I'm going to double click. I'll zoom out just a little bit. Go to game object, create empty. That makes this empty game object at the bottom of the list. I'm going to say dominoes or monomos, whatever that is. Dominoes, there we go. Now I could drag all these objects down here, or I could take the dominoes and I'll move it up temporarily. I don't want to nest it inside an object, but I'm just moving it up to the top of that stack so we can drag things around in this hierarchy. I'll select domino 6, shift click, and select domino 1, and I'll just drag and drop all of those into dominoes. And so now when I select the dominoes, okay, I missed one. So I'll figure out where that is. It's domino 7, so I'll Command Z to undo the move, grab domino 7, and throw that in the group as well. So now when I select dominoes, the group, I can move that whole thing around as one group, but I can still move independent dominoes by selecting them. Okay, and I'll just collapse that list when I'm done moving things around. So it streamlines my hierarchy. And naming objects is going to be very useful, especially as our scenes get more complicated, because we can search with this little search field here. And so right now, if I just type in cat, I get everything that's showing up with catapult or catapult rig, anything that refers to cat in the search field here. You can see it still says cat, and I'll just click on the X here to clear out that search, or I could delete the keyword. So just a couple of things to keep in mind, how we can utilize empty game objects. We'll take another look at that in future presentations as well.